a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Shawn, Breeze Books. Welcome back to my channel and another Friday Reads. I've had a great reading week and a great week period. I had a fabulous biblioadventure, TM the Book Cougars, last Friday night, and very unexpected. As I was editing my Friday Reads, I got an invitation from Meredith Hambrock, who is a young novelist, former writer-in-residence at the Saskatoon Public Library, and she loved Saskatoon so much that she has stayed in town. Her second novel's coming out early next year, but she invited me to go to a poetry book launch by a couple queer poets up the street. And I don't typically go to poetry book launches, even though that's my preferred way to experience poetry, is to have the poet read it to me. But I still don't ever really go to those. I'm just not much of a poetry reader, but I said, yes, indeed, let's go. So we went, and I loved the poetry that I heard so much. I bought both new books of poetry. Both of these queer Canadian poets use they, them pronouns. The first one is I Hate Parties by Jess Battis, and they live, I think, in Regina, in Saskatchewan anyway. And I'd never heard of them. They're originally from Chilliwack, BC, and they are absolutely freaking hilarious. I've never heard such hilarious poetry. All of it wasn't light and humorous, but there was humor threaded through everything they read. What I loved the most about their reading is that they would pause and make a quip or an explanation in the middle of reading their poem in a way that just made it an absolute delight to listen to. A very different tone for this next one. This is called I Feel That Way Too by Jen Papadopoulos. And they are a Lambda Literary Prize winning poet. And I'm sorry, I don't actually know where they live. This collection of poetry, it's actually kind of a maybe memoir or essay in poetry form, and it's about a topic that I'm very interested in and experienced firsthand about 10 years ago, perhaps. It was Canada's Me Too moment, which was a few years before Me Too broke out in the States. One of our most famous and well-liked broadcasters for the public radio station, the CBC radio. I don't even like to mention his name, but his name was Jean Gomeshi. And he was a musician, and he published one novel, and then he had this morning show where he interviewed all the cultural and some, I think even some political people, and especially musicians from all over Canada and the world, and he was one of our most famous broadcasters. Editing Shawn here, I decided to condense my description of the accusations made against this jerk because I think the way I described it, it was a little bit too triggering, it could be for certain viewers. So basically, he would hook up with fans who contacted him through Twitter or whatever, and then he would brutally and non-consensually rough them up. And so there was a trial, of course, criminal justice being the biggest oxymoron in Western culture. He was acquitted. Papadopoulos has written a response to all of that, and their poetry was incredibly powerful. I wanted to tell you about my night out, and I'm not finished telling you about my night out, but tell you about these collections, and maybe you'll track them down and read them your lovely selves. My evening with Meredith Hambrock did not end there. We went to Moxie's, which I had been to just for coffee or something, but I didn't realize that the bar at Moxie's, which is a pretty shishy, rather expensive place, I don't go out in the evening at all, certainly not when I'm paying, because restaurants in Canada or Saskatoon, they're just ridiculously expensive at dinner. And they had happy hour, and they have happy hour every night. $5 cocktails and beer and draft and all that. It's like, oh my God, I'm going to be going out more now that I know that it's actually within my budget, at least certain months of the year. So we had a great visit. I'm going to interview her about her second novel. I'm sorry I don't have the title in my head. Here's the cover gif in time to have that conversation go live on my channel on her publication day. All right, so that's my personal news. Without further ado, another fabulous, fascinating, absolutely, I think the adjective I used at the end of this chat is scintillating mystery guest. And this week's Mr. Guest is the acclaimed writer, Noreen Masood, joining us from the UK. Shall I call you Dr. Masood?
That's very kind of you, but Noreen is perfect.
Noreen, it shall be. So thank you so much for coming on my channel.
It's such a pleasure to be here.
Noreen Masood's memoir, Flat Place, Moving Through Empty Landscapes, Naming Complex Trauma. That's the UK subtitle. And in the American edition, it's called A Flat Place, a Memoir. It made the shortlist of the inaugural nonfiction prize for the Women's Prize in 2023. Please tell us about this book, Noreen. It sounds absolutely fascinating.
Oh, that's kind. So one of the ways that I describe the book is that it's sort of partly a memoir and partly a travelogue. It's a story of how flat landscapes make me feel on its simplest level. Flat landscapes have a reputation for being boring or bleak. Something that people tell me often is that they find flat landscapes frightening. And I understand all of those feelings, but I love flat landscapes. I always have since I was a child growing up in Lahore. I was born and raised in Pakistan. I lived there until 2 weeks before I turned 16, at which point my father disowned me and we came to the UK. And I think one of the reasons that I love flat landscapes so much is that they give me a kind of visual language for my strange experience of the world that has come out of a strange and unusual childhood in Pakistan. It wasn't a typical Pakistani Muslim childhood. It was a strange childhood because my father was a strange man. I've got a working diagnosis of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, many of us might know the phrase post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, and we often conceive it like this, that everything is sort of normal in your life, and then suddenly there's a big catastrophe, there's a big event, after which nothing is ever quite the same. And you can see what I've done there with my hand. I've traced a mountain where the big event is the kind of catastrophic event after which you have PTSD. Now, complex PTSD is a little bit different. While PTSD often refers to the impact of one identifiable singular event, complex PTSD refers to the impact of many, many events, which may or not they may be big events, they may also be tiny events that happen often from beginning when you were very, very young, before you even knew what counted as an event, let alone a traumatic event. Often the people diagnosed with complex PTSD or CPTSD are people who grew up in neglectful or abusive households. It's also a diagnosis often offered to victims of trafficking or enslavement or imprisonment of some kind. And if regular PTSD looks like a mountain with a single turning point event, the internal landscape, I think, of complex PTSD is much more like a flat landscape. For the longest time, I would look at my childhood and think, I feel so terrible. I feel utterly disconnected from the world. I feel unable to make relationships with other people. And I cannot stop thinking about my life in Pakistan. And yet, when I thought about that life, I couldn't see a single event that stood out, that explained, like a mountain explaining why I was the way I was. There was no kind of focal point. The image that entered my head was precisely that of a flat landscape, because it seemed as though when I look back at my childhood, nothing had happened to me. And it's odd because when I give an account of my life to other people, they say, well, it sounds like quite a lot did happen. But the experience of CPTSD is that it feels like there is nothing to light upon. There is no focal point, no kind of, your story doesn't follow a typical narrative, because the mountain that I'm drawing of regular PTSD is also the classic shape of narrative. So when I teach my creative writing students, we talk about Freytag's pyramid. And that's a way of thinking about narrative, which is that in a story, you have a situation, and then a problem arises, tensions build, it rises to a climax, and then we have a resolution. Now, that's a very simplified form of narrative, but it's a kind of basic expectation that we have of a story, that there should be a turning point, there should be a singular, identifiable event that changes things. And a story that doesn't follow this pattern is a difficult story to think about and a difficult story to tell. So flat landscapes provide a language, I think, for lives which don't follow these classic patterns of event.
You said that your childhood in Lahore, that the physical geography was flat as well. So there's a geographical aspect to the title, and presumably what you have written about, as well
Definitely.
as a metaphorical and psychological dimension. What kind of geographical landscape do you live in now?
So at the moment, I'm afraid I don't live in a flat landscape at all. I live in Bristol, which is very, very hilly. In fact, it's so hilly, it's making me start to feel quite ill. And my workplace at the University of Bristol is at the top of a big hill. So I've recently moved house, which means I don't need to climb that big hill every day. I can get the train now, which is lovely. But Bristol is quite close to another wonderful flat landscape, the Somerset Levels. It's the adjacent county to Bristol, and that's where we have the famous archaeological site Stonehenge. Because it's so flat, Stonehenge is visible from a long way away. That's one of the magical things about flat landscapes. They kind of collapse space and time. So it's not flat, and I wish it was flatter. But yes, as a child growing up, I grew up in the Punjab Plain, and on my way to school, I talk about this in the book, my formative encounter with flat landscapes was a set of fields that I would pass every day on my way to school. And my childhood was very cramped, very noisy, very frightening. Things were happening all the time that I didn't understand. So those flat fields represented a kind, I think, of fantasy of emptiness and peace and freedom. And then the journey, I guess, that I go on in a flat place is I visit various flat British landscapes. And if you're a flat landscape, you're often a very neglected landscape. I think of how flat states in the USA, for instance, are often called flyover country. In other words, states that it's not worth visiting, that you should just fly over to get to somewhere else. But it's flat landscapes I love, and it's flat landscapes I visit and spend time in. And every time I visited a new flat landscape, I was amazed at new
Please
aspects
come
that I
visit
discovered.
me.
Oh,
Sorry
I'd
to
love to see the Canadian
Yeah,
prairies. I
so
would just
please come
adore
visit
that.
me. I live in Saskatchewan, which is Canada's version of flyover country.
Amazing. What do you feel about the flat landscapes around you? I imagine there's a range of feelings on different days and different times.
Yes, and I bristle when people from other kinds of geography either visit or watch my videos where I show the landscape and say, "Oh, there's nothing there." It's like, what are you
Oh, they're
talking about?
so
There's all this
wrong.
beautiful sky and
Oh,
whatnot.
this.
Yeah, I grew up on a farm, so very flat and prairie, Saskatchewan, and I wasn't cut out in any way for the farming lifestyle. But as an adult, coming home to the farm and coming home to that landscape was always very comforting. Now I live in a
Oh,
city in the same type of landscape, and yes, there is a certain comfort to the hominess of the prairies. So I'm really excited to read your memoir.
so lovely. How far do you have to go from where you live now to see those big skies and those flat spaces?
I literally have to step outside my door because this part of my city is not, there's not high rises, and there's a golf course right out back, and it's all flat and gorgeous. So yes, you don't have to go very far at all.
I'm so jealous.
So standing invitation, come and visit.
You.
I'm sensing a kind of irony in the fact that there was trauma that you experienced in your childhood that you have explained in a fascinating way as this complex trauma where it was kind of flat compared to what many people think of as trauma, the big mountainous episode or event that causes the trauma, and that you lived in a flat geography, the flatlands, or it was nearby, and yet you get comfort from flatlands. Could you say a little bit more about that? It sounds a bit ironic to me, unless I'm misunderstanding what you're saying.
No, it's a really great question. And I think that irony and that paradox lies sort of at the heart of traumatic experience. And there's several aspects to that. I guess one of the things that is most painful, I think, about complex PTSD is the feeling that it is impossible to make others understand what you've been through. It's every time I tried as a younger person to explain my life to those people I met, people would say, oh, but isn't that just normal for girls in Pakistan? or something of that sort, which makes you feel very alone. It makes you feel very dismissed. So there was this great sense of a landscape inside me, a flat landscape that nobody else could see and that existed only to me. But one of the things I think we need from the world around us is for people to see us and kind of reflect us back, to kind of confirm almost, oh, yes, you're real, I understand that, or at least, or even if I don't understand that, I believe you. So one of the joys I think I get from a flat landscape is that sense of being reflected back, my internal landscape, being mirrored back by a flat landscape around me. I feel at home there. I feel seen, I guess, would be one way of putting it. Another sort of less hopeful aspect to it is, I think that our early life experiences really shape our sense of what feels real to us. And one of the things that I really noticed when I came to the UK, where, you know, things are not perfect by any means, in many ways are getting worse and worse, but simple things like when I turn on the tap in the UK, clean water comes out. I remember the first time I saw somebody drink water from the tap, my jaw dropped. It was the most, it never occurred to me that was a thing you could do, that there could be a country so decadent that drinkable water came out of the tap. And that luxury makes it seem unreal to me. It seems impossible. And so I walk around in my life in the UK feeling as though I'm in an unreal place often, because what happened to me in my early childhood, that feels real. It wasn't nice, but it shaped my sense of reality. And I think sometimes we feel a sense of comfort, even if it's a nasty thing, to re-encounter things which felt real, which is one reason, incidentally, why I think traumatized people often get re-victimized. We seek out things that are familiar, and because that feels safe to us, even if those familiar things are really bad. So there's a little bit of that going on as well, like our desire to have our internal worlds reflected back to us. We need to do two things, I think. We need to sort of feel mirrored by the world. Also, there's an extra challenge that we need to challenge that sense that that is the only reality that can exist, you know? So there's a double task we have ahead of us.
I forget the name of I think it was a Gestalt therapy theorist or something who said, in order to change, you have to accept what is now. If you can't accept it, you can't change it.
Completely. And just to know and sort of spend time with the shapes inside you. Yeah, I think that's really important.
Oh, the shapes inside you. I love that. There is a lot of other things going on in this book, A Flat Place, that makes it something more than a memoir. Tell us a little bit about those other things.
So it was very interesting. I'm a mixed race woman. My mother is white British and my father is Pakistani. I grew up in Pakistan, but as you can hear, I have a very British accent because of the strange childhood I had in Pakistan, where we were kept extremely isolated, not allowed to speak to the neighbors, very limited. My father really disapproved of my mother having friends or talking to people outside the house. We were super isolated. So I grew up there, and yet I have this strange, I sound British to people. When I started out on this journey of writing the book, I thought it would quite simply be, first of all, a book about flat landscapes. Then my agent said, okay, actually, it's so clear that your understanding of flat landscapes is filtered by your early life, so it might need to be about that as well. But then when I went on these journeys, a third element arose. One of the things that confronted me again and again, without me looking for it, was Britain's history of colonialism in so many ways, from constantly walking into shops and finding gollywogs on sale, gollywog dolls, to realizing that I was the only person of color in a space. Just over and over again, Britain's history of colonialism confronted me. One of the examples that I talk about in the book is, quite in passing, when I'm in the flat landscape of Orford Ness, somebody mentions the Chinese Wall, and I go away and look it up. And what I find out is a history of a whole Chinese battalion that worked in the UK for the Allies side. It was, the battalion was memorialized on a monument in Paris, but when the Americans entered the war, they were physically painted out in order to make room for the Americans. So one of the things that really strikes me is the way that the history of flat landscapes is also a history of colonialism. If we think about North America, for instance, and the way that the flat prairies were often presented as empty land, land that was ready to be taken and farmed and colonized, really. Flat landscapes have been painted in the American imagination as a space ripe for colonization. So there's a very painful history to flat landscapes as well. There's a kind of shape that my story could take, that many nature books often take, where you've got a problem and you go to nature and nature cures you. You know, you as an individual are cured by nature. And that's a very boring story to me, because I think that there is no, particularly if you're a person of color, there's no healing that can happen in this world without reckoning with colonialism, and without a general reckoning with colonialism. And I think the conclusion that I come to is actually not to heal, but to get angry. And a kind of, you know, it's kind of ironic again, because I feel most comfortable when I'm on my own, when I'm in these huge flat landscapes. But actually the conclusion I come to is that we need other people. We need solidarity in order for any kind of reckoning with history to happen. So in that sense, it's a bit strange, the book.
And if you could say a little bit more about the being in nature, did I understand you correctly to say that often what comes up instead of a sense of calm is a sense more of righteous anger or something like that?
For me, when I look at a flat landscape, I certainly feel calmed down. But at the same time as that calm, there's a sort of feeling of great passion. And I think it is something to do with the way that a flat landscape cuts its flat horizon line into the sky so unchangingly, so uncompromisingly. And I think that if the flat landscape was a person, it would be a person who knew the truth and didn't want to hide it, no matter what anybody said. There is a great openness in a flat landscape. There is a great sense of a truth being revealed that other people might not want to see, a truth that is difficult for people to sit with. And in that sense, it makes me think of so many countries' colonial history. So there is a calm, because it's always, it calms you down when you feel like you are not the only person who can see something, because that can make you feel insane. Yeah, when there's a truth that you understand that other people deny, then you feel insane. But when you feel the truth reflected back to you from outside, then you feel like you might belong. And a flat landscape, in its passionate extolling of the truth, I think, brings calm, weirdly.
There is something that's a little bit problematic about this psychologized, or maybe it's more generally cultural emphasis on everybody needs to calm down and find inner peace. There's all these problems that we need to solve. So I'm reminded of a book by the Jungian therapist, James Hillman. I think I've got that description right. He was a Jungian writer or therapist. And the title of the book was, We've had 50 years or something like that, 50 years of psychotherapy and the world's getting worse. So
It's spot on, exactly. I think that our society would like personal distress to be a personal problem. And then you could go away and get psychotherapized, and then you'd be cured and you'd be ready to re-enter the workforce to make money for rich people, or to kind of slot back into society. But actually, that's our current societies don't work. They don't work for everybody. They particularly don't work for people of color. And they often depend on, well, it's essentially enslaved people of color in the global south, working in sweatshops for no money, bonded labor in so many countries. Our societies don't work. And if you sense that they're not working, and if they make you sick, that's maybe quite a rational response, you know? I think that trauma isn't a personal problem, it's a social problem, it's a societal problem, you know, and often it's a very sane reaction to a broken world.
your website is fascinating in about 1,000 different ways, but on the very first page, there is a list of your projects. And one of them is flatness, and we've talked a great deal about that with this memoir, A Flat Place. But there's three others, and I'd like you to either pick one or two, or talk briefly about all three. Aphorisms, puppets, and nonsense. Goodness gracious, what a fascinating array of projects or interests.
I'm really glad you think it's fascinating. A lot of people are just like, what? Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit, I guess, about the puppet one, because that's the one I'm looking forward to. My first book was on aphorism, aphorism being a very pithy, short statement, like a proverb that seems to sum up some kind of truth. And I think of an aphorism as quite similar to a flat landscape in a way, because they both insist upon something and they don't apologize. And I find that very compelling. But the next project, when I can move on to it, is my puppet one. And you can see one of my puppets here hanging in my office at work. I bought him £4 from a garage sale, I think. I'm just really interested in, there's a weird phenomenon we have around puppets that a lot of people, again, like flat landscapes, they say they find puppets scary or creepy. Actually, there are so many, I guess, shows which depend on puppetry, and puppetry is just getting bigger and bigger in the UK, certainly as a practice. I think it's really interesting that there's something in the wooden face of a puppet, the unmoving wooden face of a puppet, that some people find easier to identify with than an actual human face. The example I often think of is in the UK, some people made a giant puppet called Little Amor. And the idea is that she was a Syrian refugee. And they walked this giant puppet through the streets of Britain. They took on a long kind of journey with the idea about raising awareness about the difficulty in Syria and the plight of refugees. And I found people's reaction to her super interesting, because people seemed to find it easier to identify with the puppet than an actual little Syrian girl. And I've got some big questions about that I want to dig into.
I can only begin to imagine what those questions would be. Holy smokes. Just before we hear about books that you would like to recommend, I have to ask you this question. Do you have any interest in writing fiction at any point?
I love this. I am actually, in fact, I can't say too much about it at this point, but I'm actually working on 2 novels side by side. I'm not allowed to work on them in detail, though, at the moment, because before I do anything else, I have to finish my academic book on flat landscapes, which I started writing in 2015. It's been nearly 10 years now. I got the contract for A Flat Place sort of partway through doing that. That book has been written, published, it's been out for like over a year, and the academic book remains unwritten. So when I've done that, I just need a good couple of weeks without any teaching responsibilities or anything like that. I'm going to be able to get it done. And then I can move on to the fiction that I'm writing.
How many hours of sleep do you allow yourself?
I'm very tired. I'm very excited about going to bed always.
So, what books have you read recently or at any point in your reading life that you'd like to recommend to me and my viewers?
So I've got 2, which I'm super excited about. The first one came out a few years ago. It's Real Life by Brandon Taylor. And
yes.
Brandon Taylor is an extraordinary author. I think it is wild to me that Real Life did not win any of the awards that it was shortlisted for. It's just a completely unique, I think, portrayal of Black life in America. It follows a group of friends on an American university campus. The protagonist is Black, most of his friends are white. It's about the kind of particular experiences of being a young, gay Black man from a working class background. And Brandon Taylor's background is profoundly working class, which already makes him an outlier in Western publishing. So many of the voices we hear are middle class voices, and I include myself, my own voice in that. He's an extraordinary writer. He's an extraordinary thinker.
And he's also profoundly gay.
So gay. It's and such a nuanced, brilliant portrayal of queer life. Brilliant book. I'm really excited to read The Late Americans next, but I haven't had time. Have you read it? What do you think?
I have not. I do very much enjoy his literary criticism, though, and
he's
a bit of a few waves recent about one of the Booker nominees. Shall we leave it at that and let people discover it?
I'm terrified of him. Like, I'm a lesbian, but I've got like a massive platonic crush on Brandon Taylor, because I just think he's a force of nature. It's amazing.
Absolutely.
So, Brandon Taylor's Real Life, I wholeheartedly recommend. And the second book I'd love to recommend to your viewers is a book that I chaired an event with this author yesterday, in fact. And it's just been published in the UK. It's Ibtisam Azem's novel. In English, the title is The Book of Disappearance. Azem is a Palestinian author and journalist, and the Book of Disappearance is almost like a work of speculative fiction. And it imagines a situation where Israelis wake up one day and find that all of the Arabs, all of the Palestinians have vanished from Israel. Already, I mean, this is such an interesting premise because so much of the language that we hear around the Israel-Palestine conflict, a lot of the language is about, the Palestinians must leave, there cannot be peace while the Palestinians are here. So it takes that kind of brutal rhetoric very seriously and says, well, what if they did vanish? What would happen then? And the things that happen are quite unexpected. It's an extraordinary novel.
I have not heard of it. I see here it's been translated into English by the novelist Sinan Antoon.
Who I believe is actually Ibtisam's husband or partner.
Oh, wow, this sounds fascinating.
It's truly amazing. It's really heartbreaking as well. And it's very frightening. It's one of those books where everything that happens is very small, very simple, very factual. And yet by the end of it, I could feel the hair standing up on the back of my neck. It was terrifying.
Jeepers, there's so much else I want to ask you and talk about, but this has been an absolutely scintillating, challenging, very valuable conversation for me. Thank you so much, and I hope that you will come back someday.
I'd love to. Thank you for having me. I've had a lovely chat.
Scintillating indeed. As I say every time, and it's always true because I'm very selective in terms of who I invite for my mystery guests. I can't wait to read Noreen's book and hopefully have her back on to chat about it. With a little help from a dear friend, I've been quite productive on BookTube. I've put 3 videos up in the last week, since last week's Friday Reads. The next episode of Sharon and Shawn Talk Books got a lot of response. She was particularly vibrant and erudite. Not that she isn't always, but she was just at the top of her form. It was a really fun conversation and the video turned out great. So check that out if you are so inclined. And then I taped such a backlog of zooming in chats last fall and maybe into January before all the personal things that I've had to deal with in 2024 took over. And so I have this huge backlog. So I have finally had a chance to edit and post my chat with Ros about the death of literary fiction. It was a fabulous conversation. And then Lindy and I had a Zoom chat this week. I asked her to do the editing because I'm just had too much going on this week. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. About the Governor General's Award, the literary awards in Canada. We don't talk about that other shameful prize that should be cancelled completely, and I'm not a big believer in cancel culture, but I certainly believe this jerk of a prize who take money from one of the world's leading investors in an Israeli bomb factory or something should not be discussed in polite company. So Lindy and I have transferred our loyalty and our interest from that shit show to the Governor General's Award, which is the oldest Canadian literary prize. And so we talked about, they don't have a long list or a short list, but they, like I think the National Book Award in the US, they have finalists. And the finalists were announced this week. Lindy and I had a chat, and the chat just went up this morning, so check that out. Okay, so this week I have finished 2, and I'm going to check in on a preliminary check-in on 1. The 2 that I finished, I was incredibly focused on getting these done in time to interview their authors yesterday, and it just about killed me. But I loved both novels so much that it was a delightful strenuousness to get the books read, because I didn't want to skim or rush my reading. I was so immersed in both novels, but it's like, oh my God, I have so many more pages left. Stayed up till 2 a.m. Wednesday night, got up in the morning early, finished the last 20 pages of each, had breakfast, went back to sleep, and then interviewed these guys. So the first one is The Inheritance by, well, I have been mispronouncing her name all these years. It's not actually Cauvery, Madhavan. It's Cauvery. And this is her 4th novel, I believe, and just came out about a month ago, The Inheritance. And Rónán Hession's 3rd novel, Ghost Mountain. And these are both arcs that they sent me in the mail. And I wanted to have a chat with the 2 of them together. And we had an absolutely wonderful chat yesterday about these novels. As I said when I checked in on them in a preliminary way, both writers have outdone themselves. The Inheritance is the main story set in 1986, and an Irish Londoner, 29 years old or something, finds out in the first sentence of the novel that his older sister, who he was raised with, is actually his mother, and his mom is actually his grandmother. And that freaks him out, and at the same time he receives an inheritance from two, I think they might have been great uncles who were both priests back in County Cork in Ireland. The last one died and they left their little cottage or whatever to our protagonist. And he was so mixed up and confused and at loose ends about what he'd just learned about his own identity that he decided to go live there. And the story goes from there. It's a really rich story of community, and the setting is almost like the main character. It's just beautiful, described so vividly. And he is one of those characters you can't help but fall in love with. And there is a lot of plot, and then there is a historical plot that we go back and forth between about a really important historical battle in 1602 that happened in the same part of Ireland, right on the coast, where the English colonial bastards defeated and massacred the Irish forces they were battling against, and that plays into the more contemporary plot in a really spellbinding way. I just thought it was terrific. It's really difficult to pick out what I loved the most, but if you put a gun against my head, I would say it's the dialogue. The dialogue is so rich and you can just hear it. This is a book screaming to be on audio, and we talk about that at the end of the chat. So passionately recommend The Inheritance by Cauvery Madhavan. Ghost Mountain is also just a wonderful novel, and it is, I'm not sure quirky is the right word, but the people of a town wake up to find out that there's a mountain that's just sprouted up out of the earth, and it causes all kinds of mayhem and affects the lives of the characters in this story. The story is broken up into 3 main sections or books, and so it's actually a couple different generations of the people in this town. The main character, at least in the first part, is Acho, and he's a bit of a lost soul and a young soul, and he gets himself into so many foibles, especially within himself, kind of a grumpy. He's just not very good at being in a marriage. He's not very good in social situations, and he's got an inner grumpiness that gets him into scrapes that are freaking hilarious, I have to say. There's a lot more to his character than that. And the woman who discovered the mountain while walking her dog, she's a main character throughout the whole novel. The town drunk who becomes a different person, very much about social identity as well. The labels people put on us, in particular the town drunk, because he assumes another identity, and you're going to have to read the novel to find out. But it's threaded through with wisdom and humor and an insistent eccentricity that entertains and provokes a lot of deep thought. It's a one-of-a-kind novel. I think it's the best thing Rónán Hession has written to date, and I recommend it also very passionately. So those are the 2 that I finished. I have gotten a bare start on Anne Michael's novel that's on the Booker shortlist, Held. She's a Canadian author. I think it's her 3rd novel. I've said recently that it was her 2nd, but I think there's been one in between that I missed. This has been a bit of a Marmite book on BookTube and in terms of people that are reading the long list and the short list for the Booker. And I'm doing it on audio with the book open in my lap, an audio text combo. And the audiobook is read breathily and beautifully by the author, Anne Michaels. And after the first chapter, I'm completely wowed by this. I think it's just stunning. The writing is as beautiful as I remember it being in Fugitive Pieces, if not more beautiful. And I was led to believe by some of the feedback that there wasn't much of a story, and there very much is a story, but there's a lot of ruminations and stuff threaded throughout. I just find it incredibly powerful, and there's one thing that stuck with me from the first chapter. I mean, the opening premise is that it's a soldier. He's been wounded by an explosion during the war. In the aftermath of that, he's lying on the ground We think he's probably dying. He thinks he's probably dying. And so memories are coming up and described in just pristine, almost in places epigrammatic prose. And one of them is about the seaside French town where he grew up. That the women who knitted the sweaters, but there was a different word than sweater, I think, for their fisherman husband, they each of them had a signature error that they would make in the knitting, so that if the body was washed up on shore, that the fisherman drowned, the identity could go back to which town, because there was a certain knitting style for each little village, but also this signature error could go right back to the family, to the woman who knit the sweater. And the way that's described is just so beautiful. Anyway, preliminary thoughts. I'm going to be discussing this next weekend with one of my Patreon subscribers, Melanie. So, and that chat will, I think, be on my channel eventually, but boy, it's sure starting out sumptuously. And I am going to start one book. It's a buddy read with the wonderful Sonia of An Enthusiastic Reader. It's our last buddy read of the year. And my first check-in isn't until about 10 days, but I think I'll probably start it before next Friday. And this is a novel by Claire Fuller. It's her maybe penultimate novel. I think she might have had one come out since then. Unsettled Ground. I heard a lot about it when it came out. Bought it based on that. Now enough time has passed that I've forgotten what I've heard about it, which is ideal. And I'm going to buddy read it with, this is from 2021. I'm going to buddy read it with Sonia. This is about twins, and they're 51. They live with their mother in the countryside, in the English countryside, and their mom dies. And then plot ensues about the land, what's going to happen to the land, and stuff like that. It sounds totally like a Shawn book. I have read one by Claire Fuller that I really enjoyed. Swimming lessons about the marginalia, that the notes the wife put into books in her husband's library. It's a powerful novel. Don't remember very much about it, I have to say, all these years later, but other than that, I really, really enjoyed it. So let's get into this. All right, well, that's what I got for this week. Thanks for watching.